and hang out.
The sanctuary?
A hot tub sanctuary?
So
you're going to rescue like hot tubs that are endangered and let them come live on your property?
It'll be a sanctuary for people, but it'll have a hot tub. So it'll be like
you guys heard it first here. Colin is planting a church centered around hot tubs.
Nice. So what will happen is whoever is giving the message that week will be in the hot tub, and they'll have their Bible on the handrail, and everybody else will sit on the porch around them, envious of the hot tub. And it will be up to them to be humble enough to say, I don't need to get in the hot tub right now. I need to learn about the word. It's a great learning experience for all involved.
If you get a hot tub, you're kind of just in time for the cooler weather. So that might be nice.
And it'll be one of those things where it's like, like two people from the church walk up and they're like, hey, our mom says that we're ready to be your right and left hand man. And I'm like, oh, you want to sit in this cup, this large cup? You don't know what kind of cup this is. You can't sit on my left side or my right side. You want to know why? Because I've got my legs spread out and I'm kind of laying down in this thing. So nice. Check yourself, John and James, sons of Zebedee. All right.
Man. I just recently got a grill set up. So even though the cooler weather is coming for us in this part of the country, I'm now ready for fall and winter to grill outside.
Ooh, that'll be fun.
So there we go. Yeah.
That'll be super fun and exciting. I think that the weather has been really, really nice lately. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're going to have some more warm days before it gets cold. Yeah. It'll be cold in the mornings, but
I've enjoyed having a few chillier days. I have.
Yes, me too. See, I like the chillier days, but I don't think they're fully here to stay yet. You got to remember, like, there's usually that like fake summer in like either late October or early November. So we're still counting on that. So anyway, that'll be when we can grill and cook out. So
that sounds awesome. So you should bring your grill over to the hot tub sanctuary porch.
Yeah, exactly.
And we'll do a kind of crossover thing. That'll be fun.
Yeah, well, the sacrament's got to be served somehow.
Bob, what do you have to contribute?
What better way than a grill?
Bob, what do you have to contribute? Tell me you have a project where you're making really nice porch chairs out of old driftwood, and then we'll have a perfect thing. Zach will bring the grill. You bring these chairs, and I'll have the hot tub, and it'll be the perfect porch party.
Well, actually, I was making it more out of like old electronics, more so than anything else.
Oh, okay. So it's like a bunch of motherboards like soldered together to make a like sort of reclining chair.
Yeah.
I'm imagining like the Game of Thrones throne, but with like keyboards.
Good. That's good.
Yes.
Like
yes. So, but I was thinking about using like the seat to be more like a server style motherboard, because the server styles usually has multiple processor chips, and so you got a socket for each cheek as you're sitting there. So
here's the thing:
usually two sockets, so one socket for each cheek.
The pins on the microchips are very, very sharp. And if you got stabbed by just one of them, it would really hurt. But the thing about pins, it's the same thing with nails. If there's a whole bunch of them and you have a wide surface area on your bum, you could sit on it and it would spread it all out. And
that's true.
It wouldn't hurt you.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh, good times. Okay, you guys ready to start?
Yeah, we got to get rid of this nonsense.
Let's do it.
I'm Zach.
I'm Colin.
And I'm Bob.
And welcome to the Houseplants Podcast.
And we're here to talk about
lined up. We are here to talk about
music,
media,
and the mission of Jesus.
Heck yes.
Yeah.
A lot of other stuff.
Awesome.
And a lot of scripture lately.
Boring. Who cares about that?
We're just making thesis papers every single
episode.
Get
back to the top 10 list where you judge things. Topical events only.
No,
we're here to talk about the top 10 who wore it best pastors who wore the V-necks best, who wore the plaid shirts best.
Yeah, we prefer expository podcasting.
Let's start with Benny Hinn from 1978. He's just wearing the heck out of that sweater. All right, so I'll give him a 9. So
Top 10 best faith healers.
he wore that sweater awesome, and he wore that jacket great. It was a 9 out of 10 until he took it off and started hitting people with it. A 2. He did not wear it well. All right, so all right, we're still being silly. Let's get into things here. We're going to be talking about another biblical figure tonight. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this one. This should be a lot of fun.
So we have been finding some really interesting characters that are sort of, like I said, like we always say, are overlooked a little bit just because they have maybe a smaller section in the grand story. But Second Kings, what we're going to be talking about in Second Kings tonight is it's just chock full of these really interesting stories that are a part of Elijah's like story and a part of the like city of Israel, and a lot of the kind of influences of Samaria at the time, the influences of what would later become like Damascus and some of the rulers that were kind of impeding on Israel and stuff. And so that's going to be a big part of it. But also, like, we like to take a look at, like, you know, the unsung heroes. And tonight it's Bob's chance to talk about one of his heroes. So that'll be a lot of fun.
I'm not sure if I would say hero, but definitely an interesting figure nonetheless. It's I'm not sure if unsung hero is the best way of phrase it, but it's definitely a really, really interesting story that I think has a lot of good meat to it.
Yeah. So I say hero, but I say hero the way that Sight and Sound Theater in Branson, Michigan would say hero. Like we saw the Samson musical about Samson, and the first
he's a superhero actually.
The first song
he's like the Incredible Hulk of the Bible.
The first song that they sing is like he goes like, he was a hero, but not a typical hero. You know, it's like he was a different kind of man, and it's like
kind of an anti-hero sometimes.
Right.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, yes.
So these are the ones we don't hear about. These are the cyborgs of the DCU. Or the you know what I'm saying?
Cyborg.
These are the Mad Hatter of the Batman universe.
Yeah, it's like Iron Man or Doctor Strange before they had movies.
You don't hear about them as much. So anyway, before we get into any of that, we're going to do some worship. We have been lately, I feel like we've been really, really hitting some good strides with quality, and I've really been excited. Me and Zach have been kind of pushing each other to not only come to worship with some great lyrical and stylistic choices, but also just the quality has been getting really good. Not that we're trying to make this a performance, but one of the good things about doing things post is getting a chance to kind of look at and how to like clean up some things that we wouldn't have been able to do live.
Our listeners are probably not ready for it yet, but their kids are going to love it.
And all of our listeners may already know this, but every Back to the Future reference on the podcast was started by Zach. So there you go.
Yes,
and gotta keep it going. I have a quota to meet.
Yeah, you got a list of 20 of them.
And if you follow us on Patreon, then there's a strong probability you might have actually heard this one ahead of time. So, and if you want to get a sneak peek at what some of this worship music is, or even get the opportunity to download and have it in your own music library, just check us out over there.
So, without further ado, here it is.
Sign of life, so dead and dry. From this its root, a branch bearing fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of knowledge and fear of the Lord. And of all these things he will delight in the fear of the Lord. Not judging by what he sees or by what he hears with his eyes nor his ears, but with righteousness he'll judge for the poor, giving them their needs. Oh, with the rod of his mouth he will strike the earth and rule it as king. The wolf will lie down with the lamb, the leopard and goat, the lion and calf, a child to lead them he shall play over the den of the cobra, hands to the vipers, for they no longer sting. The earth shall be filled from mountain to sea with the knowledge of the Lord. Hey, like Jesse's tree, a remnant will be reclaimed over a sea so dry. The gathered exiles cry. The nations in search of a resting place will come to his feet, for he made a way from the scorching desert sands over 7 cold streams, a highway for us.
Holy Spirit, I ask that you pour out yourself on this podcast. I ask, Lord, that you would speak through us, that you would reach our listeners and anyone within the sound of my voice. Pray that you would use the scriptures just to glorify Jesus and to draw people to the Father. We thank you so much for your love for us. We thank you for guiding us. And I just pray that this podcast would give you glory. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. So,
All right.
we are okay. So I'm gonna kind of open up the floor for Bobby here. I want to hear, Bob, what made you pick Naaman of all of the biblical figures?
Well, I don't know. He's definitely one that is not really spoken of very much. I've never heard a sermon on Naaman or Naaman. I don't know how to pronounce the name properly, but I've been saying it Naaman, but now I hear you guys saying Naaman, so I'm thinking maybe that might be the better way of saying it. So, but once again, I've never heard it preached. I've never heard it verbalized or pronounced, but I found the story quite intriguing. Once again, not necessarily from a heroic perspective as much as it is just a really interesting story. I felt like there's a lot of good stuff in this story.
Yeah, that's true.
And just a lot of things going on here, and just really, I don't know. I didn't feel like there was very many tales like this one, especially from the Old Testament perspective, if that makes sense. You know, occasionally you see people with illnesses coming out to Jesus in the New Testament. I mean, that's somewhat of a regular occurrence, and saying, "Hey, heal me." But seeing it in this fashion was very different. I kind of put it somewhat. The closest parallel you could say is kind of like the centurion who comes to Jesus, but
My favorite character from the Bible.
Yeah, but at the same time, there's also a lot of differences here, and this story's a little bit more in detail than what the centurion story is. But man, I found like it was some good stuff, and not only that, but he's not like the main character. The main character here is actually the prophet Elisha, Elisha, not Elijah. So, which it's very easy to get those two mixed up when you're trying to pronounce them. But
double portion.
Yeah. So, but
one of them had a great affinity for bears.
One of them was a wimp and ran away.
Elisha did have an affinity for bears. Oh my goodness.
One of them was a wimp and ran away. That's what I always tell people. Hey, dogs are going to kill you, Jezebel. Oh, yeah, we'll kill you. I shouldn't have threatened her.
Yeah, so today's story does take place in 2 Kings chapter 5. And this is after the split of the nation of Israel. So you got Israel and Judah. This takes place with Elisha the prophet, as I mentioned. It takes place in Israel itself, not in the land of Judah, but in the nation of Israel. As Joram, the son of Ahab, is king of Israel, and it specifically mentions the 2 Kings here mentions is the king of Israel in Samaria. So I don't know much about that particular situation of why he had to say he's the king of Israel in Samaria, but the Bible specifically does mention that. But we're introduced to this character of Naaman, who is not part of the nation of Israel. In fact, he is a commander for the king of Aram. And Aram is a nation who built many different city kingdoms, such as Damascus, and did have a very strong pull in this region. The Bible describes him as mighty or valiant. He's a soldier who had some sort of skin disease. A lot of translations will say leprosy, but sometimes you'll see a footnote that just says skin disease, because at this time in history, all skin diseases were kind of treated as leprosy. So he had a wife who had a servant girl who 2 Kings 5 mentions that the bands of Sumerians, it says in verse 2, had invaded the land of Israel, and among their captives was a little girl who had been given to Naaman's wife as a maid. And so that's what it really says about that. That's not necessarily treated as, I find it interesting that it didn't really treat that line as a good thing. or a bad thing. It just simply says, yeah, and then this thing happened. It's like, yeah, it's just another day, just another event. Yeah. Obviously, we would hear that and think, oh, how terrible. And yet the Bible kind of says, yeah, then this thing happened, which I find it interesting that there was no kind of commentary as to whether that being good or bad. But in verse 3, it mentions that the girl mentions to her mistress, I wish that my master would go see the prophet in Samaria. He would heal him of his leprosy. So referring to, of course, Elisha. And so Naaman gets permission from his king to go. And that's kind of where the story starts off. And so which is really, really interesting. We got the story about a non-Israeli figure. The entire chapter is mostly pretty much dedicated to him, to this non-Israeli figure who comes in and has this events happen to him as he interacts with Israel, and more specifically with Elijah.
So what's interesting about that, Bob, let's take a break from I just wanted to say, so obviously we know in modern day Christianity that God is able to use those that aren't of like native Jewish like blood for great things.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
And so this is another example of God saying, like, I'm going to use this particular person. And what's interesting is there are several different instances throughout the minor prophets leading up to the gospel where armies come in and wipe out the bad influences in Israel. So like I'm just thinking of random examples, but like maybe like Hosea or something where he's like, you better be careful because God's going to bring his wrath and like this army is going to come and wipe everyone out. And so I think this is one of the earlier examples of God saying like, no, I'm going to use this like commander to like help get some of that kind of stuff done because he's a soldier, even though he's not he's like he's a, what do you call it? Aramean or whatever you want to say.
Sure. Yeah. From the nation of Aram. Yeah. Whatever you would refer to them as, Amarians or what.
So he's using
whatever you want to use there.
Not native of Israel. And I just think that's significant to this story.
Yeah. And so, it is quite interesting. And so I think it's one of the things that kind of drew me to him specifically is that you've got an outsider, he doesn't know about the customs. He doesn't understand the culture. He doesn't know who these people even are. We've just got this high level military figure who's like, hey, I've got this, who has this disease that's overcome him. He's like, and feeling kind of helpless in a lot of ways. And
well, it's because like other cultures become inundated in like Israel as they are interacting with people of Israel, and then kind of so you see like Roman soldiers become Christian, believing in Jesus, like the Roman centurion.
Because the Roman Empire was around in Jerusalem.
They're just like a part of the culture. So like you go out every day and you see Jewish people who believe in God, and so that can kind of take its hold. And as we read the scriptures, we're going to find out that Naaman really does believe that he's been blessed by God, as far as what I understand of the scripture.
It reminds me a lot of what we talked about on one of our Civ bonus episodes, which you guys should totally check out if you haven't seen yet. But remember, we talked about the way that kind of like the news about the God of Israel spread, and then later how the gospel of Jesus spread. Really similar because it's like God just uses Jews and then later Christians kind of to be in the lives of other people. And so he draws like these like Gentiles in who don't have a background, people like Naaman, but they end up around people from Israel, and then they kind of experience God that way.
Oh yeah. And I think it's stories like this that make me question. It just kind of raises an eyebrow because of how we see the Jews treat outsiders in more of the gospel setting.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and this, he becomes he's got an entire chapter pretty much dedicated to his story, and yet he's more or less, but outsiders are very much disregarded by Jews. No, granted, at this point in time, in the time of Jesus, the outsiders are also the ones, they're conquerors. So I understand some of the sentiments against them, but just the idea of inviting Gentiles into the faith is just so disregarded.
Especially at this time in Second Kings, because this is way back in the BC era before we started hearing about that kind of thing. You had, central locations where different cultures were coming from, but you didn't have. Yeah, that's a good point. And then also, I wanted to mention this before we get into the story too. I want to find out how it's possible that a person with leprosy, or even if it was just a regular skin disease, I want to find out how it's possible that person was able to still like walk around and do things without people saying he needs to be quarantined or put in a pit. I guess his standing as a soldier made it harder for him to be called out in that way.
Well, in many ways, it's depends on the situation. You look at Deuteronomy, and that actually does call for those individuals to be quarantined, more or less, cover their mouth, and actually shout out "unclean, unclean" as they come close to anybody.
Yeah.
And so, right. That was part of the Jewish law already. And I'm assuming that probably other nations had similar things. When we see him traveling, he has an entourage with him, but it's easy to assume that there was probably nobody in his chariot that he was riding in, as he was to make sure that it doesn't spread to other people. Despite the fact I'm sure we're all certain that it probably, these situations probably do spread quite a bit. The idea of germ theory and the more greater details were still unknown, but at the same time, people were aware. Once again, back in Deuteronomy, we have evidence of the idea of how Jews handled these situations, and maybe they took cleanliness more seriously than other nations. But I don't think that. But I think, and you can easily assume that based on the dietary habits they had. But I don't think it was that much more in this sense. I don't think quarantining your sick was necessarily that strange of an idea. But I don't know. Maybe I'm completely off base there. So
I think that I don't think you're off base. I think that it's just, I guess, interesting that this time period, you would think that there would be a lot more prejudice against people with diseases, people from other countries, and all of this stuff. So I just
I'm sure there was. I am certain there was. Yeah.
Right.
Well, all the more reason why I think this story is so intriguing.
But Naaman was a big figure in the from the Aramean nation. So
see, that's what I think. I think that his standing has enough weight,
like an ambassador or something.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. And one of the first things we find in this story is the fact that Naaman does, in fact, travel with a letter from his king giving him permission to come and see and to be healed within the nation of Israel. And it's one of the first major points we have here. So in verse 4, his king says, the king of Aram said, "Go then, and I will send along a letter to the king of Israel." So he does. And I think this right here is where you've got your first game of telephone being played, because the little girl mentions that I wish my Lord would see the prophet who is in Samaria. And what they do is that the commander then takes this information, talks to the king, and he says, yeah, let me go and send you a letter for the king of Israel, not for the prophet, but for the king. And it says, and the letter reads, when he reaches it, it says, "When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent you my servant Naaman, that you may cure him of his leprosy or skin disease, that you may cure him of his illness, his skin illness." And then verse 7 says, when the king of Israel read this letter, he tore his clothes. So he went into a state of mourning, public mourning, and
rending his garments.
Yes. And he says, "Am I God to give life or death, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy?" just look at and see how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me. They're so he's like, they're asking this impossible task. They just want to start a fight between our nations. It's a setup, and
right, because the implication is they send him there saying like, hey, cure his leprosy, and he's like, I can't. So now it's like I'm asked to do this thing, and when I can't do it, I'm going to be looked at as the guy who refused to do the thing, and it'll cause us to go to war.
Yeah, but here's the thing. I can forgive the Naaman and his king for not thinking about sending him to the prophet directly. They don't necessarily understand the command structure of they may not fully understand the command structure of Israel in the sense that the prophet of Israel in this day and age actually has the ability to add and remove the king as the prophet sees fit on God's behalf. But for the king to not think about Elisha, for the king to not think about a prophet to send him to, that's where I find this issue kind of humorous, because Elisha catches wind of this and he's like, no, King Joram, send him over to me, But why didn't the king first suggest this? Why did Elisha have to speak up and say, no, send him over to me? Why, that the king it should be pretty obvious for the king to send him to the prophet Elisha, or maybe that's me thinking about it in hindsight.
I think that, I think that there is something to be said about that, because by Joram I'm not saying that this is what the Bible is saying there. I'm saying that I think that his mentality as king is that he thinks he should be the one to fix all whatever, and he doesn't even think to relinquish that authority to God. And as a result, I think he's showing his, what do you call it? He's showing his face, whatever that phrase is.
Sure.
Basically,
sure.
he's
revealing his true colors, so to speak.
Well, yeah, but not just that, but he's also his mind immediately goes to I can't do this thing, but he never thinks maybe there is because I believe in the Lord, maybe there's a person who I know I can trust to get this done. It's kind of the difference between somebody like Nebuchadnezzar beginning to rely on Daniel versus Joram not really relying on Elisha the way he should.
And Nebuchadnezzar was not from the Jewish nation, so there's another example there.
There you go.
So, but I think you bring up a really good point there, Colin, because how often do we encounter our situations, especially ones that are clearly meant for God? Clearly it is God who heals, and then wonder how we're supposed to solve this problem. If the problem is clearly for God, then address it to God and turn it over to God. It doesn't mean that we're not supposed to do anything. King Joram still had to send the man to Elisha after all. So we might still have some role to play in that, but ultimately recognizing that it is not us who does it, but in fact it is God who makes things happen through us or through another means. But whatever it is, the point is that a thing that is clearly meant for God, we need to be open to the idea that those actually get issued to God.
Right. Yeah, I agree. All right. So what's next? What's next in this crazy story?
Well, what's next is the fact that that Naaman is sent over to Elisha,
who has a double portion.
Yes, and Elisha sends out his servant and tells him to go wash in the river 7 times.
Right.
And so which is interesting to me, because once again, Naaman gets upset for this. Okay. But the reason why I find this washing to be interesting is the fact that Naaman would not have been aware of some of the Jewish customs. So he would not have recognized the fact that this washing of 7 times is actually the mikveh, which is the cleansing bath. It appears several times in the book of Leviticus. This is a ritual cleansing that takes place usually among priests before they go in. It's like the start of the cleansing that you before you go, especially when going into the Holy of Holies. But this is a cleansing ritual. This is a serious act of worship is the and so he's telling Naaman to go basically perform this cleansing ritual, which is really really interesting to me.
So what the real truth of this whole story is that he just had like a few mud pies basically on his arms and legs. And he had just never gone and given himself a bath. He left the spoils of war on him, and he had like little pieces of skin and stuff just from like killing people. And then somebody's like, go and wash yourself in the
He's seen a shower.
Go wash yourself in the river 7 times. He's like, ugh. That makes me so mad. I hate taking a bath. I haven't taken a bath in several years.
Yeah. Well, but you know what? That might have been how Naaman felt like he was being treated. I've got this leprosy. Well, go take a bath, and he gets upset about this. He doesn't recognize that it's a cleansing ritual, but it could be. He wanted something grandiose. He wanted some big event to take place that was going to cure him of this, and he even responds with, "I've got rivers in my homeland. We've got better rivers than this."
Yeah, it's like
I can go wash back home. Why did I come all out here just to take a bath?
Yeah.
Well, so here's another
kind
thing
of lame,
Yeah, this is so lame.
I think I read somebody was writing about this passage, and they were saying Naaman probably was expecting like some kind of very shamanistic sort of ritual. Because like back then they had like magi's, and they had people who basically would like do all this crazy like song and dance sort of stuff, and almost kind of like cast spells. And so I think he was expecting like Gandalf to come out with like a glowing staff or something, and when the means of the healing turns out to be something just real ordinary, he's like, what's this? Like,
verse 11 he says, Naaman says in verse 11, he says, I thought that for me, he would surely come out and stand and call on the name of the Lord, his God, and would wave his hand over the spot and cure the leprosy.
So again, I think Naaman, just like the Joram guy, I think that what we're seeing here is a problem with, like self-centered mentality and thinking, definitely on the part of Joram and on Naaman, but
sure,
what's interesting is I believe that what we see in his willingness to eventually do this thing is God requires an act of faith on our part for healing to happen. Like a lot of times, not a lot of times, every single time there needs to be some version of having some form of faith, whether it's a girl believing that if she just touches Jesus's like cloak, she'll be healed, or somebody being obedient to baptizing themselves, things like that. It looks different for different people throughout the scripture, but in this case, I think Elisha, on behalf of God, God is explaining to Elisha that if this guy just kind of like swallows his pride and does this thing, that's like the act of faith. Like that'll be the first, that'll be the start of it. So like he denies it first, but he denies doing it out of pride, essentially. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
He wants it to be a big ceremony because he feels that I think one of two things are true. Either he thinks that he is worth a bigger ceremony, like his position, his prestige is deserving of a bigger ceremony, or
I think that definitely played into it.
Or he has a shaky belief on what it requires to heal, and he thinks that it requires a big show. He's either mistaken about how God heals, or he's too concerned with his own image.
Well, with being an outsider, once again, I kind of give him a little bit past there that he doesn't, not really understanding how the God of Israel will sometimes interact. I'm sure he's heard the stories of some of the previous things, no doubt. There's absolutely no doubt that the battle between Elijah and calling down fire from heaven, made its rounds. So I have no doubt about that.
Well,
but,
so like,
but
this
the
is
smaller
maybe
things he may not be more familiar with because they're not as interesting. And so he might have been expecting something more grandiose because he's not as familiar. But you're right. There's absolutely no doubt that he felt like he was a bigger deal. I thought Elisha himself would at least come out here with me and maybe wave his hands around.
You're saying that part of that probably is his ignorance of the way God works.
Well, yeah.
And he is thinking more based on his own understanding of Christianity that isn't fully fleshed out. Okay.
Well, at this time, Judaism. But yes, but there's no doubt there's a level of pride there.
Right.
How dare he command me to do something so basic and so simple?
The servant. It's interesting. We should maybe do an episode on Elisha's servant, because he ends up doing a lot of interesting things, and they just call him the servant. He also is involved in Jehu's story as well.
Well, we'll actually get to him a little bit here in a bit because he definitely does come up quite a bit. But you're right. I mean, and the question is, how often does our pride often get in the way of the simple commands we're given by God?
This resonates a lot with me. If I can just share for a minute, I think I talked about this on another podcast, but the idea that like God wasn't working the way I thought he was supposed to work based on my own understanding, and then like kind of coming to a different realization. I think I mentioned it to you guys about like how God speaks to me versus how I thought God was supposed to speak to people. And thinking to yourself like, I God's never spoken in my ear, so clearly God's not speaking to me. And it's like, no. But do you get what I'm saying? Like, because of your own understanding, because you're not willing to humble yourself to the idea that God works the way he works. It's not like for you to dictate how it works. And so in the same way, I think that's a lesson he needs to learn, is that things don't operate because the way that he dictates they work. It works the way God dictates it works. So
and so what comes next here is then that Naaman's servant kind of calls him out a little bit during this rage, and so it says here that in verse 13, but a servant approached and said to Naaman, Father, if the prophet had commanded you to do something difficult, would you not have done it? How much more when all he said to you was wash and be clean? And so he went down and immersed himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God. His flesh was restored like the flesh of a young boy, and he was clean.
My version of the Bible, I think this is because yours says immersed. Mine says dipped, which is fun.
Yes. He
went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times.
That word right there is actually really, really interesting. And I even made a side note of it because in the Septuagint, which is the Old Testament translated into Greek, is one of the things that early translations were really much based heavily on. The Septuagint, the Greek word that is used there is baptizo, or where we get which is a verb to baptize. So which I found to be very, very interesting. The fact that was the that's how it was translated into Greek, was basically he was being baptized 7 times as part of this cleansing.
Gotcha. Okay.
So yes, but I found it interesting, but that it took his servant calling him out. I mean, how often do we need people in our lives to talk some sense into us? How often do we surround ourselves with people who are willing to call us out when we're being ridiculous? Name it. If it was something difficult, you would have done it. You're angry not because of what he's commanded you, but simply because it's simple. Why not just give it a shot? You would have done the difficult thing. Why not do the simple one?
There you go. Pride.
So I find that to be fun.
You know what Yul Brynner would say from Cool Runnings? He would say, I see pride. I see power. I say bad a mother who don't take no crap off of nobody.
Yeah.
But in this case, the implication is bad. He's like, I see that, and that's wrong.
Yeah.
I want you to not be that way.
Well, it's funny, like God uses a servant here,
To speak truth.
to
Yes.
speak truth. Like God's
At
always
first it's
using
Elisha's
like
servant,
an
and then it's his.
an unlikely person.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's first it's Elisha's servant, and then it's his servants, and
Yeah.
so it's interesting that he has that's what I'm saying. He's a flawed person, but at least he was wise enough to say like, oh, maybe there's something to this, and he gives it a
Yeah.
shot.
Absolutely. Yeah. So he gave it a shot, and it worked. It worked exactly as Elisha told him it would. And so he returned to the man of God, that is Elisha. He and all his company. He came and stood before him and said, "Now I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. Please accept a present from your servant." But Elisha said, "As our Lord lives, whom I serve, I will accept nothing." And so he urged him. Naaman urged him, and yet Elisha still refused. And he says, and so Naaman then requests, you know what? If you won't take my gifts, let me just then take some dirt back with me. And so, which seems to be a really weird request, but it's still really, really cool here.
Yeah, he says, if not, please let there be given to your servant 2 mule loads of earth.
Mm-hmm.
Mule loads of earth.
Yes.
That's really interesting.
Yes. Yeah.
Unit of measurement.
Yes. Yeah. Let me take back as your servant. Let me just take back these 2 mule loads of earth.
What a unit of measurement. It's like, I 2 mule loads of earth isn't that far. I used to shoot mules every day in my T16.
My T16.
Whatever.
It's yes. And so
I flew the Kessel Run in 2 mule loads.
Yes. Yeah. He says, "Let me just take back these 2 mule loads of earth to be given to your servant, for your servant will no longer offer burnt offering or sacrifices to any other god except the Lord." And then he basically asks for a pardon. He's like, because when my master goes and worships, my master's going to kneel down, and he's going to use me for support, which means I'm going to end up kneeling down. And so I'm asking in advance forgiveness for having bowed down to these others. Basically saying, look, I'm going to end up bowing down, but it's not because it's an act of worship. So please forgive me for taking an act of worship against these other gods in the future, because it's not going to be where my heart is. My heart is with the God of Israel for what he has done for me. And Elisha says, go in peace. And so I find this interesting. Yeah.
Again, I think there's some pride going on here. I think he wants to do something that will put a spotlight on him. Say like, look at this gift I've brought to the Lord. Mm-hmm. Like, I think Elisha catches him in that, saying like, this isn't a thing. This is your heart's sort of in the right place, but
yes, but it's not something that I can accept. And I think a lot of it,
right.
A lot of it so much, I think Elisha recognizes where the power comes from. He knew that he could not accept this gift because he didn't do it. God did it.
Right.
Through him, not him at all. So he could not accept this gift. And so, and apparently this is what God desired. God said, no, don't accept this gift. And so it keeps Elisha humble and also helps create a new paradigm for Naaman to understand who Yahweh really is.
Yeah.
And so the fact that so Elisha found it wrong to accept a gift directly due to the healing, a payment for something God freely gave. And so when we see this act of grace being expressed even here in the Old Testament, setting us up for what Jesus shows us over and over again.
And I also think that it makes sense that I think that Elisha knows more about the scripture and the correct way to handle these things.
Oh, sure.
And I think that he is than maybe anybody else at this particular moment. And I think that he understands that if Naaman gives him the gift and he accepts it, it's like Elisha was the one who did it.
Exactly.
And then secondly, if it's a gift given in exchange for a miracle, then that's not good either.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. This is not a payment situation.
Now, in terms of the sacrifice, though, in terms of that aspect of it, if it is a act of sacrifice to the Lord in terms of reverence to God, there are situations in the Old Testament where that makes sense, and that
Sure.
is of Jewish. There are Jewish beliefs that revolve around that belief system. But even
Yes.
still,
Well-
Naaman feels like he needs to somehow thank him or apologize to him for
Yes.
whatever, because he says, in this matter, may the Lord pardon your servant. I think he's talking about himself.
Yes,
right?
yeah, himself. Yes.
When my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, leaning on my arm,
Mhm.
and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. When I bow myself in the house, he says that a bunch of times. The Lord pardon your servant in this matter.
Yes.
So instead of Elijah trying to like, right.
Yeah. So my master's going to lean on my arm, and I'm going to end up bowing in this other
Basically
house of
in the
worship.
temple of like a pagan idol.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
He's
yeah.
like, pardon me for because
Yeah.
it's in other words, I'm asking for forgiveness because this is going to happen, but it's not because. But as he expressed in the previous statement, there is no God except the God of Israel.
Uh-huh.
So
I think
it's like, I'm not trying to worship him, but it's going to be seen as an act of worship, and I apologize, and please, I want forgiveness for that. Yeah,
I think
that's
Elijah,
really interesting because it kind of like illustrates this point about like he has these duties that are assigned to him because of his role. Like,
sure,
he's already like committed to this role and like serving his king, and so that's something that's like kind of like I don't know if it's a case by case basis, but like how often does God allow that sort of thing? Like, I don't know, like one of the things I think about is like people who were in the military, like, military sometimes military personnel end up, having to kill people or whatever. And it's kind of like, well, they've, the world is a fallen place. And so there are some people who are kind of like called to serve in this particular role where like, murder is wrong, but this is a different thing. And so it's like they ask for God's forgiveness in the case of like, they had basically a task that they had to fulfill,
Yeah, and I think so much of it is a case by case because so much of it I think is about where your heart actually is.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah, so these people are asked for forgiveness because I recognize this isn't right, but it's what I've been called. That's what I've been told to do. Recognizing that if I don't do it, then chances are I'm going to be killed, if not severely punished.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of things that we can be like really absolutist about as Christians, and, don't get me wrong, like I don't believe we are to break any of God's commandments. But like in the case of Naaman, like he was already serving the king and couldn't get out of that without basically causing a lot of dishonor, like if he would have broken that commitment that he made.
And you got to remember, in this day and age, gods were very much nation bound in some respects. Yeah. And so what his king was worshiping was the king of their nation. We have previously talked about this in our angelic in our heavenly host episodes.
Yeah.
But yeah, so he's feeling like it's in a rock and a hard spot. On top of that, he's not actually Jewish. He recognized Yahweh is the king of. There is no other God except the king of Israel, except the God over Israel. But he's like, but he doesn't have to our knowledge, he doesn't have necessarily a synagogue that he could go to, or some place, a Jewish leader by which he can work with, and so I mean, the tribe of Levites was in charge of that, and they're all stationed in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
That is literally their job as an entire people group. So it's, but yeah, you get what I'm trying to say. It's
right.
But in the end, there Elijah does say to him, "Go in peace." To take your dirt, and you got your forgiveness. Go in peace.
I think that the point of that quick go in peace has more weight to it than, because like if you really think about a situation, imagine a person coming into to a church today and they don't know, like imagine it's like a military guy who's never been a Christian or something, and he's like, oh my whatever, I have constant headaches, and God tells you to baptize him and then his headaches are healed or something, right? So then immediately afterwards he's like, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna bring you some ammunition and I'm gonna like flip and just put that in the church and then you guys can have that. And then like it's like you as a pastor being like, we don't need any of that.
Well, we can't accept that.
And then he's like, yeah, well then you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna go out. I'm gonna go and tell all my military friends just like how great you guys are and how great God is, and I'm gonna like give ammo to some other people, just say sorry for being such a jerk. And then instead of you going like, let me explain why this is a little off still, he's just like, you know what, go in peace.
Yeah.
You know what? You're right. Go ahead. Yeah. You're fine.
Yeah, I think there is some weight to the argument because, not being an outsider, he doesn't know how to properly express worship. And you're right. As you mentioned previously, the Jewish faith did have ways in which you give this offering for this reason and this offering for that reason. But he's an outsider. He doesn't understand. He doesn't have that mindset, that frame of reference by which to rely on. And so so thus there's a difference from Elijah's perspective specifically of, wait a minute, he's trying to give me this gift, not give it to God. And I can't accept
not just
that
too, but he's trying to buy his healing.
Yeah, exactly. Trying to buy his healing. And that's
God
not how it works.
God doesn't require us to exchange. There doesn't need to be an exchange of goods. Like he wants an exchange of hearts. So like when
I like that actually.
That's a great statement, Colin. That's a great statement. I love that. He doesn't want an exchange of good. He wants an exchange of hearts. I love that statement.
So
that's awesome.
So I'm often not as articulate, but that one's a zinger. We'll keep that in the book. But the thing that's like weird though is what I'm trying to say is that I think Elijah doesn't feel the need to like address, even though this is still like him just being like, remember that one thing that I did? Well, I'm sorry about that, and I won't do that. And if the Lord pardons me, then you'll know that I'm good, and I'll just take these two things of earth and I'll sacrifice them. And then he's just like, okay, go in peace, man. Like your heart's in the right place. I think you're on the right track. It's fine. But what's funny is I think that the Gehazi thing,
yes, that's what we're getting to,
undoes that somewhat, which is why it's so impactful. Because it's like him being taught sort of by Elijah that he doesn't need to exchange anything. And then Gehazi is like, no, you do. You have to give me some silver.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
like, no.
Yeah. So let's get into that. So Naaman heads out, and while after he left, we're finally given for the first time a name to Elisha's servant, and that is, as you said, Gehazi. And Gehazi, he thought, my master has let that Aramean Naaman off too lightly by not accepting from him what he offered. As the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something out of him. And so that is literally what it says here in verse 20. And so he goes up to Naaman. So Gehazi runs after him and chases him down, and he makes up a story about how prophets come from Ephraim and ask for money and clothing. Naaman, not knowing that this was a lie, willingly gives up the relatively small request. It is a relatively small request given how much he was trying to offer Elijah in the first place. It's like, if you just give me just a little bit of money and just 2 garments. At the start of the story, we're told that specifically he brought 10 garments with him as a gift for hoping that he could, because he brought a bunch of stuff expecting to have to pay for the treatment in some capacity. And so Gehazi asked for, please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothing, is what it says. So Naaman actually says, please accept 2 talents So once again, trying to offer more, a talent. So he urged him and tied up 2 talents of silver and 2 bags with 2 changes of clothing, and gave them to 2 of his servants, who carried them in front of Gehazi. When he came to the citadel, he took the bags from them and stored them inside. He dismissed the man. He dismissed Naaman's servants who had carried it all this way back, and then they left. And then things are about ready to hit the fan.
Yeah, well, like what we just talked about the idea that like he didn't need to exchange anything. So like I think that Gehazi is literally like undoing that lesson.
Yes. This passage in my Bible is actually subtitled Gehazi's greed.
Yeah, mine says Gehazi's greed and punishment. But what I think is sad about that is that he's like, all is well. He's like, no, it's all good. It's just
we had these men come in. Would you be willing to help them out?
And that's on the surface that's fine. I don't know if Naaman is completely like considering that the same thing. Yeah. But I think that because Gehazi is connected to Elisha, that he's like feeling like he wanted to do something for Elisha. So now he's like sort of like, oh, now I can do something. But Elijah was like, you don't need to do anything.
Yes.
So, so weight on that.
Yeah, and so we have this what we would call in our society a white lie. It is a lie. Yes, technically. Is it really? Did he harm anybody? No. Naaman wanted to give him more, anyways.
Right.
Naaman actually gave him more than what he was even asking for in this white lie. But is it what God wanted?
No.
Is it what God commanded? No. And so therefore, because it's not what God desired, it is the opposite of what God desired. It is by definition a sin, which goes back to an episode we had just not that long ago. Even this white lie situation flew in the face of what God had commanded, and thus it is wrong, even as mundane as it might be. Once again, Naaman's willingly giving it, but it's against God's will.
Yeah. So I think that I think that something is lost on Naaman because of that. I'm sure he'll turn out to be fine. He's now been healed, so I don't think that's something you can just forget about or anything.
Oh no. I'm sure he's talking about this for years to come.
Yeah, but I do think that I think that maybe he left that entire situation more confused than he would have been. Yeah. Had he his last words that he had received from that area been Elisha saying, "Go in peace."
Yeah. So think about this. He tells a story, and he concludes it. And scenario 1, he concludes it with, "And the man of God would not accept my gifts at all. It cost me nothing to have this. It cost me nothing." Right. And then you got scenario 2, and where he tells his story, and he concludes it with, "And all it cost me was 2 talents and 2 garments."
Yeah.
That's a very different conclusion with a very different implications attached to it. And he doesn't know the difference. He doesn't know the difference. And yet God is trying to tell a story, and we've got man's greed getting in the way of what that story is supposed to be. Yeah. So we have the story here with this is where things begin to really get kind of where things begin to hit the fan. In verse 25, it says, "He went in and stood before his master, and Elisha said to him, 'Where have you been, Gehazi?' He answered, 'Your servant has not gone anywhere at all.'" So now you're covering up a lie with another lie.
Right.
Yeah. And he says, but then Elijah said to him, Did I not go with you in spirit when someone left his chariots to meet you? Is this a time to accept money and accept clothing, olive orchards and vineyards, sheep and oxen, and male and female slaves? See, therefore the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and to your descendants forever. So he left his presence leprous, as white as snow. And so because of his transgressions, because he lied about it, he is cursed with the leprosy that Naaman had removed from his body.
Yeah. So like, there's a few things I want to discuss because we're getting on time a little bit. One of the things I want to discuss is because we did this on the first episode about those 3 steps. So you have like who he was based on some other stuff. We have what the scripture says, and we have like the impact.
Yeah.
So first thing we'll say is this, this is small impact, but the servant now has 7 generations of leprosy. That's really sad. But I want to talk more about the impact that Naaman had as far as what happens after this. There's nothing written.
Right. We have no idea what happens after this.
After chapter 5. But here's what I read on a study, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah.
So he is a man of great authority because he's a commander of the Syrian army. And he is subject to the kings of Syria, like the what's that guy's name? Ben-Hadad? Ben-Hadad.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's interesting is that he's going to go back to Syria. So what does that mean for our bigger story? Well, a Syrian who's not a Jew, who followed ridiculous orders to go and dip himself in the river, was healed of his leprosy, which the Syrian Empire knew about. They knew that he was sick with this affliction. So now he comes back. He doesn't have the affliction anymore. And when they ask him, just like you said, Bob, he's going to tell them like, no, this Hebrew rabbi, this guy, Elisha, who was a servant of the Lord, told me what to do. And it was because of God that I was healed. And it wasn't in the way that I expected. And I think that rippled because Syria is not, Syria does not contain Judaism in many places until things like this happen, where a very influential figure comes back and says, hey, this happened to me. And it's because of the Lord of Israel, not because of any of our gods or anything. That's how I know it's for real.
It's spreading from a testimony.
That's exactly right. Yep. And so what does that look like today? So what, like fire that catches other fires, And so what happens when that testimony brings fire to a few others, and then the Sumerians come back to, the Syrians, not the Sumerians. They come back to, Israel later, and some of them believe in Judaism. You don't know what kind of spread that has, but God has mentioned many times, Jesus has mentioned it too, about the spreading of the seed. And so some will, land on good soil. Some will land on bad soil. So you don't really know, but some will get trapped by the rocks and stuff. I have a feeling that Naaman is the kind of person that is a good soil person, though he's not perfect. Who do we know in the world that was perfect before they became a believer? Right. And so somebody like Naaman, is just the same as somebody like Matthew the apostle. Who were we before? And so I think that if we can take one impact away from this, it would be that he goes back to Syria and says, this happened. And not only does he say that, but he apologizes for worshiping in another temple. And so you've got to wonder if that is something going forward where he'll say I'm not going to go to the Rimmon worship anymore. Not doing that, because I'm not only going to burn an offering to the Lord of Israel, but I hope the Lord of Israel forgives me for that. And so I think that will and did have big repercussions for Syria.
I love how the way that Scripture sets up these stories with the Jewish people, because they were meant to be a light to the Gentiles, kind of showing them who their God is, who Yahweh is. and a lot of what the Old Testament shows us about people kind of like, you know, showing and like sharing their testimonies and like demonstrating it through healing. A lot of those are the things that end up happening later with the church when people were
Right.
spreading the message about Jesus. So
Absolutely.
it's just really cool. Yeah, it's like when we talk about Melchizedek later, that's the one that I kind of did some research on. I want to talk a lot about foreshadowing because I believe the Old Testament, the more I look at it, it really foreshadows a lot of like how the kingdom works, kind of gives us a preview of what's to come. And so I think with Naaman, it's, yeah, like Colin mentioned earlier, like Cornelius, the centurion guy who, like, his servant was healed. He wasn't, you know, from a Jewish background either, but
Exactly.
Jesus demonstrated healing for him.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, like you see these things that, you know, Jesus fulfilled. Jesus was able to do it perfectly. You know, nobody in the Old Testament was perfect. Not even prophets like Elisha, you know, they're still human beings.
Absolutely.
But they're like a, you know, scripture shows us the parts of their lives that kind of like echo what Christ was about to do. And so that's really, really cool.
So yeah, I if there's one, like I said, if there's one way that we can take heart on this story, I think it's because of, you know, what then happens after with Syria. And you know, it's crazy too, because in a way I feel like his personal servants probably caught some of that fire too, because they were the ones
sure.
who suggested that he do that stuff. Like they were like, you know, because I like what it says. I like that his servants said to him, in the ESV it says my father. So I'm wondering if his servants consider him like a father figure, and they say my father.
Yes. But basically, that's exactly how it is.
It is a great word. The prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? He actually said to you, wash and be clean. And so, like, I think it's interesting that they call him a great prophet, and like they already kind of are, like in that spirit. So I think already his like retinue believes. So what will that impact later? Like, I don't know. I just think that's, yeah. I know there's not as much info after this, but I just think that's one good way to look at it. All right. So, Bob, what else? What do we got? You got anything else you want to wrap up about?
Well, yeah, just the fact that you kind of touched a lot on that, of, you know, the implications that he's going to have throughout. We don't know who all's lives he touched, but the fact that he was a significant individual, there's no doubt that he touched a lot of lives with this healing and the telling and the respect for the nation of Israel in a lot of ways. So we don't know the full extent of it, but we do know that this was significant enough that the writers felt like it was necessary to include. And that, in a lot of ways, is easy to say, well, that's good enough for me.
Yeah. And then, you know, another impact of this is that Elisha's ministry is continued, you know, strongly.
Yes.
You know, Elisha is working in 2 Kings in a lot of people's lives. And so I like to think that, you know,
he's inherited a double portion of Elijah's spirit too. So
Elisha's double portion.
Yeah, double portion, baby.
What a
he's supposed to do a whole bunch more.
Greed is terrible unless you're Elisha. And then it's fine.
Well, he didn't. Well, did he ask for it? Yeah.
Yes, he did.
He did.
Elijah goes, "What can I do for you before I, you know, go?"
Give me a double portion of that spirit.
He's like, "I want double the power you had." And then Elijah's like, "You know what? F it. Sure,
fine.
Like, it's whatever." No, not like that. But.
But I think there's a difference there, because once again, it has to do with the heart. You know, even Jesus says, "You ask because you do not have, because you do not ask." And it's not because we should be asking for out of greed, but asking for the Spirit of God to move in incredible ways among us. Or, you know, if our hearts are aligned with that of Christ, and when we do make requests, it is going to be aligned with the will of God in the first place. And that's kind of what we're getting at here. And so Whereas Elisha's servant, that was not the case. But for Elisha, but in Elijah's case, where he's asked for more, he felt like it was a holy and worthy request.
And I think I'm being silly. I am actually being silly about that because in reality, what Elisha was asking for wasn't like power. It was
the spirit of God,
the fervent spirit of the Lord.
Right.
Yes, to rest within you. I mean, who doesn't want a double portion of the Holy Spirit?
It was, not
them?
for His glory. It was for God's. Like,
yes.
One of the things that I found that I want to do lately, like occasionally, last few times that I've had people like, want prayer for healing or whatever. Like I found myself wanting to pray, may this person be healed, for God's glory. Like, I'll start praying things like, about how, how great it would show God is if He were to step in this situation. And so, I feel like stories like this kind of make me feel motivated that way. Like it's all about like, demonstrating who God is because He's good and He's at work. And I believe that God is at work even in times where we don't see it. Not everybody gets healed. But we believe God is still at work even in the midst of those situations. But in those situations where there is like a healing where like it can be attributed to nothing other than God, like that's just great. Like that's so cool to be able to talk about.
And we see here a glimpse of what is to come. You mentioned use the word foreshadowing, Zach, earlier, and I think that's a good way of foreshadowing the grace of Yahweh, which the Old Testament often gets a bad rap. That the God of the Old Testament is different from the God in the New Testament. And this right here helps demonstrate the fact that is not true at all. That the grace, the God was always about grace in the beginning. Yeah. And so, and then that this is just one more demonstration of that to the people who had such a hard time understanding and recognizing that fact.
There you go.
It's almost like they should read some of the Old Testament.
Yeah, you should read the Bible more, you jerks. You right, guys? Awesome. Naaman, a very small tale, but a tale that's important and one that's really cool for us for today. I think a lot of these people we're going to be talking about exemplify a aspect of what we can aspire to be. I think Naaman is the kind of person who was stubborn at first and then realized that he needed to take sort of a leap of faith based on some of the things that were being presented to him. And then afterwards he realized a lot about who God really was and that God was God and that others were not. And so that's something that we can take away from that about the way we need to think about God. Stephen was a servant and we talked about him last time. And he was a person who was willing to die for his faith, but also to like uphold the truth of the scripture, regardless of how like much stuff was, people were yelling at him, threatening to kill him. These are going to be cool aspects about like how we think about who we are as Christians. And so next week, I think we should keep the ball rolling with Melchizedek.
Oh yes.
Zach has a really good notes already for that. And then afterwards,
he was kind of like a superhero too. Real mysterious
and after that,
secret identity.
After that, I'll do Jehu, who is not too far off from where we are reading now. So that'll be a lot of fun. But yeah, thank you for listening. Check us out on Patreon. We are going to have some new content up there very soon. For anybody who wants to support our channel, you can go on there and become a shrub, I think, or a fern.
Fern, maybe. Yep, it's fern.
And if you want to check out any of our other stuff, you can check out this podcast on Spotify or whatever other places you can get your
Facebook
podcasts.
pages, which hasn't been super active lately, but we'll work on that some more.
There you go. But we love you and thank you for listening, and we will catch you next time.
Yeah, buddy.
Shalom.